So again, my name is Fernando. I will be your speaker for whatever time we have tonight. And we are going to be talking about FSMA. What is it? Uh, what does it mean to my business? And what I'm going to do here is just 30,000 feet uh, overview of the different regulations that came out of FSMA. However, I will try to do so by giving you enough information for you to figure out whether the regulation applies to you and what are the basic requirements. And of course, if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. So the way we put together this presentation is actually to enable you to be able to ask whatever questions you have. So I'm going to give you a little bit of information, and in about 30 minutes or so, I'll stop. Then we will have a questions session. If you have questions while I'm doing the presentation, just put it together, put it in the questions and answer window, and I'm looking at them. So as they come out, I will try to answer them as well. So here we go. First of all, know that FDA stands for Food Safety Modernization Act. It's a law signed by President Barack Obama back in 2011. Right now, let's establish that this law applies to FDA regulated industries. So if your business is regulated by USDA, TTB, so note right now that these laws do not apply to you. So this is only for FDA regulated industries, okay? There might be some notes that we have to take care of that. But in general, if you are FDA regulated, FSMA will hit you one way or another. If you are regulated by USDA or you're working with alcoholic beverages, so you're regulated by TTB, then this is not for you. Okay. In order to understand why only FDA, we have to understand the industry. So let's talk about a little bit about the industry and what the composition of the industry is. So our beloved food industry is composed of three branches. First one is food service. Food service is everything that has to do with preparing food for immediate consumption by the consumer. So we are talking about restaurants, cafeterias, bakeries, food trucks, and the like. So those types of industries are typically regulated by the Department of Health in the different states or territories, as it is in Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, you're required to have what is called a sanitary license in order to open your establishment and have it working. So anything and everything that is food service, including catering service, is regulated by the health department. However, the health department uses a document that is published by FDA, which is the food code. So everything that the health department requires is coming out of the food code, or is based on the food code, okay? So food service, that's one portion. Second portion is what is called primary production, so farms. Farms, it could be animal or plants. All primary production up until FSMA was regulated by USDA. With FSMA, that changed a little bit, okay? So basically for primary production, what USDA has is what is called the good agricultural practices, okay? It's not a law, it's just some recommendations that they make, strong recommendations that they make in order for produce coming out of farms or animals coming out of farms having enough food safety conscience, if we can say it that way. So we can actually consume that produce without much consideration to whether or not it will be good or bad to eat that. Is it safe or not? Okay, so that's basically good agricultural practices under USDA. And again, FSMA changed a little bit of that, and we will look at that in a few minutes. The third leg of the manufacturing industry is, the food industry is the manufacturing branch. And in manufacturing, again, we have some divisions. There is a portion of the manufacturing industry that is covered under USDA. And that's basically anything, or in general terms, whatever is produced mainly out of meat. And when we talk about meat, we're talking about beef, pork, sheep, goat, or equines. Anything that is made out of poultry or based on poultry, meaning chicken, turkey, dog, goose, Guinea hen, rabbit, and pigeon. Also egg products and some fish, specifically the type of fish we call siluriforms, which are commonly known as catfish. All the different varieties of catfish are the only ones that are regulated by USDA. Any other type of fish is regulated by FDA. So the second portion in the manufacturing branch is what is regulated by the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, which in terms of food is basically anything containing, or in general terms, anything containing alcohol. However, we should put a note next to that because not everything that contains alcohol is covered by them. It has to exceed some portion of alcohol in the product, and depending on the type of product we're talking about, that alcohol percentage might be higher or lower. Okay, so basically what we're talking is about alcoholic beverages regulated by TTB. And again, TTB basically looks for the portion that has to do with alcohol content and all that. Basically, for anything that deals with food safety, they rely on FDA regulations and recommendations. Okay, so even though it's regulated by TTB, if you ask them about food safety, they will refer you to whatever FDA tells you to do, you do that, okay? So the last portion is whatever is manufactured in terms of food that is regulated by FDA. And it's basically anything and everything that is not covered by USDA or TTB. So if your product is not containing meat or fish, siluriforms, or egg, is talking about egg products, or is poultry, which fall under USDA, then is FDA. Okay, so when we look at the whole food industry, the whole manufacturing portion of the food industry, we can more or less say that about 75% of all the products out there are regulated by FDA. So when we talk about the regulation impacting the way FDA does business, we are actually hitting the food industry really hard because we are impacting 75% of the industry. Okay, so let's look at why do we need that? FDA exists since a long time ago. Why do we need that now? Okay, so in order to answer that, we need to look at what was going on at the time. So there were a few things going on. First of all, up to prior to FSMA, what the regulations that FDA had in effect were basically good manufacturing practices and HACCP. Okay? Good manufacturing practices were applicable to basically all the industries that FDA was overseeing, even though some industries, particular industries, had their own regulation. Like, for example, if we're talking about low acid foods in hermetically sealed containers, well, there's a regulation for that. However, that regulations assume that you have good manufacturing practices in place. So it goes back to the GMPs. And again, we have HACCP for juices or HACCP for fish products. So those, until FSMA, those were the main tools that FDA had in order to assure public health. So so what? So what? Why was that not enough? Well, if we look at what was happening in the nation at the time, we had two things. First of all, even though we had the good manufacturing practices, and in some industries we had HACCP or some other um requirements, we were still having huge outbreaks of food poisoning, outbreaks of food-related illnesses in the nation. Like in that chart, for example, where you see the map of the US, the different shades of blue, that particular chart shows the um, an overview of a specific outbreak that happened around that time, one of the many that impacted many places in the nation in different amounts. So what you see the different colors is the amount of people per 100,000 members of the population that were impacted. So those we're talking about events that were impacting the nation really hard. So in general terms, at that time, there was a study that was made and is still cited and considered to be updated or valid today. That particular study found that around 48 million people in the US alone um, are affected annually by food-related illnesses. Okay, so that's a huge number. Out of those 48 million, it is estimated that about uh, 120,000 require hospitalization and about 3,000 die. And we're talking about numbers per year. Okay, so it's a huge, huge impact. So when you consider the economic impact for the nation, it was estimated to go all the way to around 10 billion with B, $10 billion a year. So of course, this is a great impact for the nation. So that's one thing that was happening, and the other thing that was an issue that was a consideration at the time was the impact, the attack to the Twin Towers, at the World Trade Center in New York. If you remember, in 9/11, 2001, there was the attack to the Twin Towers, and there was also attacks to another buildings like the Pentagon. But the huge disaster that everybody remembers is the Twin Towers that were attacked and destroyed at the time, and that led to the Bioterrorism Act of 2002. And of course, that law mandates to do several things, including protecting the food supply. So that's the frame of reference that led to the establishment and the conversations about updating the way FDA does business, and eventually led to the establishment and the publication of FSMA. Okay, so what's FSMA's objective? Until FSMA, FDA's approach was reactive. There was an outbreak, they would go out, investigate what was going on, trying to figure out what is the food that has the contamination that is causing the illnesses, and then move to recall that product, take it out of the business. So it's a reactive approach. So FSMA's objective is to move FDA from a reactive approach to a preventive approach. And in order to be effective with that proactive approach, um, it requires FDA not only to look at the manufacturing sites, but to look all the way across the food supply. So as we will see, FDA now has jurisdiction all the way back to farms uh, and all the way down to well, almost to the consumer. So let's look at it. Okay. Um, in terms of FSMA's content, there are three main components on the law. First is to prevent food safety events. Remember, as I mentioned before, FDA's approach was reactive. So we are trying to move away from reactive, away from reacting to events to preventing the events. Okay, so we can look at those $10 billion and move them, to somewhere more manageable numbers. So preventing food safety events. The second intent of the law is to detect and respond to issues more quickly. So even we know that even though we do our best, things will happen. Okay. So if things happen, how will we be ready to detect and respond to whatever happens so that the public health is impacted the least possible? Okay. So we need to actually implement some changes at FDA to be able to react better to whatever issues arise. And finally, there's a look. We have to look at whatever is coming from outside the U.S. Okay, so that's always a complaint when we talk about the different regulations and the different trainings that we perform. Is that there is always saying, well, the product that is coming from outside is not looked at as stringently as what the way they look at us. So they have more regulations for us here trying to survive than product that comes from outside. So there's, we can argue back and forth about that because there have always been regulations for imported products, but now basically FSMA make sure that the competition is level, okay? So there's no preference treatment for imported product anymore if there was before. So basically, as we will see, any and all imported product needs to comply with basically similar requirements as any facility producing the same good here, okay? So let's look at FSMA. Again, we said that in order to be effective preventing outbreaks and protecting public health, we need to look at the whole food supply. So the whole food supply includes all the way from the suppliers to the farms, through transport to manufacturing, and then transport to the consumer. It also includes imported products, okay? So if we want to make a change, a big change, a significant change in food safety, we have to somehow cover all the different bases. So once FDA received FSMA, they started working, and work has resulted so far in 7 regulations that have been published and an 8th regulation that is in the works. Once all those 8 regulations are completed, everything in FSMA, all the intent of FSMA will be implemented. Okay, so we should not be expecting any more regulations after the 8th one. And again, if we look at the chart that we were just looking at, we can see that any and all the different components in the food supply actually have a regulation. Plus, there are some additional regulations that we will look at that further protect us consumers from the possibility of food disease. Okay, so let's look at, in this presentation, we will look again at all those 8 regulations. We're going to talk about a little bit about that. But before that, before we go into that, when Pamela and the group approached me to talk, to prepare and offer this presentation, they were concerned about fishermen and fish groups that were part of the audience. So here is a little bit about FSMA and fish. There's, I don't know, good news and bad news, I guess. The bad news, in a sense, is that FSMA has nothing, in a sense, has nothing for the fish industry. However, fish industries, in terms of manufacturing fish products, they have a regulation for that, and that regulation continues to be applicable, and you need to comply with the revised good manufacturing practices. So in that sense, there's something being done about food safety for fish. However, the bad news is that that regulation only covers manufacturing sites. There's nothing prior to that. So there's nothing in terms of regulation, FDA regulations to cover fishermen or fishing vessels or what we call the villa pesqueras, so the fisheries. Um, and those are regulated basically locally in the state or the different territories. In Puerto Rico, we have a Puerto Rico law to cover basically all fisheries activities, including fishermen and fisheries activities at the, as I call, Villa Pesqueras. However, that law, which by the way regards the Department of Natural Resources as the owner of the implementation of the law, that law basically deals with giving out permits to fish, and that's basically there's no much about that. They also establish seasons on when it is allowed to harvest some fishes and some not. But other than that, that's it. You know, there's no more. There's nothing on food safety on that law. Also, if we are talking about aquaculture, is not regulated or is not under the Department of Natural Resources. Instead, it is addressed by the Department of Agriculture, the local Department of Agriculture. So again, manufacturing is looked by FDA with that regulation. As stated there, 21 CFR 123, which I'm going to explain to you what that means right now. But other than that, that's it. You know, fisheries is regulated locally. So let's stop a minute and talk about what it means 21 CFR 123. All the different regulations of the US government are compiled in what is called the Code of Federal Regulations, which is like an encyclopedia. You remember encyclopedias? They had every subject you can imagine, organized probably by alphabetically. The same way, all the different regulations of the United States are contained or compiled in the Code of Federal Regulations. Now, the way they are organized is by agency. So every agency or entity, from the president down to everyone, they have their own little book or big book in the Code of Federal Regulations. When we are talking about FDA regulations, we say is the 21. The 21 CFR, we're talking about the regulations on FDA. If we are talking about 7 CFR or 9 CFR, we're talking about USDA regulations. But 21 CFR refers to FDA regulations. And within that book, regulation 123 is the one that deals with fish and fish products. So I mentioned that because as I talk about the different regulations, you will see the reference to the regulation per se. So in the chat, I'm going to include a location in the internet where you can actually go there and search for the specific regulation that you need. So you just go to that page. There's a little window. You select chapter 21. It says for Food and Drug Administration, and then it takes you to another window where there's like a table with different numbers. And what you have to do there actually gives you like number ranges. So if you're looking at 123, so you look at the right range, and then it's opening another window, and you'll see all the different regulations, and you can actually look for the number that you want. And in there, you'll see all the details uh, about that specific law that you're searching for. Okay, so let's stop for a minute here and see if we have some questions right now.
All right, so now is the moment. Anyone that is interested in clarifying any questions regarding what Professor Perez has talked so far, you can do so via the chat, or you can work around the question and answer. At this point, we don't have any open questions, Professor. So
Okay,
maybe some pop up, I might then flag you on them, okay?
okay, okay, let's move on then. So before we look at the content of the different regulations, let's establish two details that are of general application and that you should know because they might affect you or your business. The first one is that these different regulations have exceptions for what they call qualified facilities. So if your business is regarded or can be regarded as a qualified facility, then you have what they call modified requirements, which means basically that you need not to comply with all the requirements, but only a portion of them. Basically, the these qualified requirements apply to small and very small businesses. Now, the definition of business size depends on whether, on either a number of full-time employees in your business or, which is the more common one, the average annual sales. Okay, it's a 3-year average on annual sales, not profit, sales. Okay, so for example, if you are calculating the average for year 2021, you will take the 3 previous years. So you have to take 2018, 2019, and 2020. You average that, and if the average is below the number that they give you, then and you meet the other conditions that we will see later on, then your facility can be regarded as a qualified facility, which again means that you need not to comply with all the requirements, but only a portion of them. Okay. Now, the other thing is that once you are a qualified facility, it's not a condition that will be with you forever. That exemption must be requested, and if you do not request it in time, you lose the privilege, and then you need to comply with all the requirements uh, in the law. Okay, so that's condition number one. The other issue here is what's called facility registration. FDA requires facilities who manufacture, process, pack, or hold food to register. That requirement, you see there, the reference in the law is 21 CFR 1 Subpart H. And you have there all the details of who needs to register and who doesn't require to be registered. Now, that registration, you have to do it the first time, whatever time of the year you need to. And then you every 2 years, you have to renew, okay, the registration. And they will communicate with you, send you email, probably call you on the phone, um, um, because they do review their records, and they call to check how the facility is doing, and so on and so forth. So that's facility registration. If you haven't done so, I urge you to use your favorite browser and search for FDA facility registration. When you type that, you will get many hits. One of the links there, it's from fda.gov, and it will read registration of food facilities and other submissions. Okay, so you go to that page, and in there you will see the different links to the different submissions that you could do. One of them being facility registration. Also in that page, you will see guidance for industry. FDA has many guidances for many issues like allergens and many other things. So there's a guidance on food, I'm sorry, on facility registration. So if you have any further questions that are not addressed in that web page, be sure to download the guidance and read through, and most probably your questions will be answered there. Okay, so um, qualified facilities, facility registration. We talked about that. Let's jump right into the different regulations. And we will start with the farms. Okay, FDA is now looking at farms. Not every farm, but some specific farms. Which farms? Well, this regulation applies to produce that is typically consumed without processing. So for example, if you are producing lettuce, there's no processing on that. If you're producing melons, there's no processing on that. Okay, so you just basically cut it and eat it. Okay, so there's no cooking, if you will. There's no killing step for microorganisms. So if there's produce that is consumed without further processing, then these regulations applies to it. It covers, um, it includes entities or businesses that involve in production, harvest, packing, or holding these goods. So if you have a business that is gathering melon, okay, they do not produce the melon, but they gather and pack, okay, then that facility is also covered by this regulation. Yeah. Okay, so there are also some farms which include manufacturing activity. Okay, so if there are some, if these farms have these produce, they also are included in this regulation. Now, who is not covered by this regulation? Well, raw agricultural products. So we need to understand what's the difference here. When the regulation talks about raw agricultural products, is referring to any produce that in order to be consumed, it requires cooking or some processing. Okay. So for example, if I'm producing, say, wheat, well, wheat, nobody actually eats wheat raw. It's somehow processed before being eaten. So wheat is not covered. So lettuce is covered because lettuce, you can actually take it out of the hydroponic system, and some people even out of the ground, and just put it in your mouth and eat it. So that one is covered. However, there are some goods that are also included, and the line is a little bit blurry. One of them is plantain. Plantain is also covered by this regulation. Basically, because when we talk about green plantains, well, actually nobody eats a raw green plantain, but there's the chance that you send out some green plantains to the market. That plantain matures, and now you have a ripe plantain that somebody can buy and eat it. Just peel it and eat it as is. So plantain is actually covered by this regulation. And right there you see the exception on qualified facilities. So a facility with annual sales below $25,000 and that's average of 3 years, is exempted from this law. But if you're working on a farm, you know that $25,000 most probably is not a farm that is the only source of income, okay? Because that's it's a very low amount. At least in Puerto Rico it is, and I assume that in the Virgin Islands it might be as well. So you have right there the number, okay? So if your facility, the annual 3-year average, the 3-year average uh, annual sales is below $25,000, then your facility can be regarded as exempted, and you can request to be regarded as a qualified facility and just submit to the modified requirements. Now, what are the requirements? That law has many requirements, starting with water quality. You have to comply with some, you have to do some tests, you have to do some sampling, and there's, depending on the water source, it will tell you how often you have to sample and what are the quality um, indicators. And you have to, again, do some tests and keep records on all that. It also has requirements on biological soil amendments, okay, compost. One of the no-nos of this regulation is no compost containing human waste, okay? So nothing on human compost can be applied to uh, soil in these farms. There are also requirements for sprouts, basically requirements saying that you have to perform lab tests in order to assure that it is free from pathogens. There's requirements on animal presence in the farm, either domestic animals, it's a no-no, and for wild type of animals, well, you have to do whatever is reasonable. Of course, whatever is reasonable includes monitoring and exclusion. Do whatever you need to do in order to exclude animals from your land or your greenhouses or whatever. And again, taking a rifle and shooting them down is not an option. Okay, so what we are doing is trying to exclude, keep them out, put farms, put meshes, or whatever is adequate. Of course, if you have many acres, it would be unreasonable to put meshes all over the crops in order for birds not to fly in. That's unreasonable. So that's what they say. Well, you have to monitor. The one thing is to have one bird here and there flying by. Well, you cannot prevent that. But if you have flocks of animal every day in your farm, then you have a problem. You have to do something. Um, there's also conditions or requirements on employee training, health and hygiene, and the condition of tools, equipment, and structure, basically talking about it has to be in good repair and it has to be clean and sanitized, okay? One thing is about the structure is that we should mention is that, for example, you should not harvest any crop that has fallen to the floor. For example, you're harvesting bananas. Well, you cannot let your bananas fall to the ground. Otherwise, you are not allowed to harvest them, okay, and sell them in the open market. So you need to do something in order to avoid soil to get into the crop. So if you take that concept to the structure, if you have a structure that is all dusty and filled with soil everywhere, and you put your crops there, is as bad as just dropping your crops to the floor because it will get contaminated. So your structures have to be, the beans and everything that you're using has to be in a sanitary condition. And we see here in the first regulation, we start seeing here that it required procedures, meaning instructions, SOPs, where your instructions are to perform everyday activities from all the different activities related to producing the goods, harvesting the goods, packaging the goods, packing the goods, and you also need records. Records are forms containing objective evidence on whatever happened at the farm at that day, or whatever particular process that you're performing, and you need to collect data on what is it that you're doing, because that may eventually impact positively or negatively whatever happened to the crops. So you need to maintain procedures and records, and you need them both. Okay, the second regulation, again, you see here the number on the regulation, 21 CFR 117, is called the Good Manufacturing Practices and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food. Okay? So we will see in a few minutes that there is a similar regulation with a similar title, but it's a focus on animal food for animals. Okay, so this one is only for human food, and again it applies to facilities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food for sale in the U.S. If our facility is preparing material to be sold outside of the US, you still need to comply because you are producing in US territory. But it is written this way because, say, for example, you are producing in, I don't know, Guatemala, okay? So in Guatemala, they have to comply with regulations from Guatemala. But if they want to sell in the US market, they also need to comply with the regulations of the US. So for us, who are in US territory, this is a law that applies to us because we are manufacturing, processing, packing, or holding food in US territory, so it applies to us. Uh, and that's why it's stated in that way. Which facilities are exempted? Well, if you are on the USDA jurisdiction or TTB jurisdiction, this law is not for you. Uh, if you have other regulations that apply to your business, like for example, we talked about fish, but we can also talk about juices or products that contain juice or poop or pulp from either fruits or vegetables. They also have their own regulation. Bottled water has its own regulation. Low acid foods in hermetically sealed containers, they have their own regulations, etc. So if you are in those under those regulations, well, you follow whatever it says on that regulation. The only portion that applies from this law is the portion on good manufacturing practices because it's the basis for the other regulation. But you need not to comply with the portion on the preventive controls. And again, the exempt facility, the qualified facility. Here is the condition. We need a 3-year average annual sales below $500,000. Right? That's the main condition. There are two other conditions. The other two conditions is that over 50% of those sales were directed either directly to the consumer or to other businesses that actually sold to the consumer. So, for example, if I'm producing and I sell and I have a little store in my factory and I sell directly to consumers, then I can count those sales to this end. The other condition is that I manufacture the food and I sell, say, for example, to supermarket, and the supermarket actually sells directly to the consumer. So those type of sales are actually also counted towards this number. It is not considered toward the number if what I'm making is an ingredient that is sold to a manufacturing site that will actually use that to make another product that will eventually further go on the food supply chain. or if I'm selling to a distributor, and then that distributor sells to supermarkets who eventually sell to consumers. So those type of sales cannot be counted towards that 50%. Okay. The third condition is that your customers need to be within a radius of 275 miles from your site. Okay, so here in Puerto Rico, it's a small island, which is the case as the Virgin Islands. Well, you can actually go so far in a car, okay, before hitting the ocean. But if as is the case in some of the islands, the next island, which is within 275 miles. So that's a consideration that you need to also look at. Where are your customers and whether or not they actually meet those requirements. Okay, so what is within this law? We have different requirements here. The first one, it says good manufacturing practices, which sounds very easy, very simple, just three little words. However, there is a lot included there. There are requirements starting with personnel requirements on training, hygiene, dress codes, etc. There are requirements for facility construction, maintenance, design. There's requirements on equipment, design, maintenance, uh, cleaning and sanitation, calibration, also instruments, process control requirements, warehousing, etc. There's a lot included within those three simple words, GMP, or good manufacturing practices. Beyond the good manufacturing practices, this regulation has requirements, first of all, to establish what is called a food safety plan, and it has to be a risk-based food safety plan. The way you do that in the different trainings, because all these regulations have their own standardized training. And when you go to a training, they explain to you, well, there's a hazard, and you have to evaluate the risk associated to that hazard. And you do that throughout your different processes, different products, different ingredients. And then when you identify that there is a significant risk, then you have to establish the preventive controls, okay, to actually minimize that risk. There's also requirements for an approved supplier program. And we're gonna talk a little bit more about that, but basically the idea there is for you to be certain that your suppliers are giving you good material, and you need not to worry that your suppliers will actually impact the food safety condition on your product. Okay. Okay, there's also a requirement for a recall plan. Now we will talk about that a little bit more, but basically that's something that changed for FSMA. Previous to FSMA, recalls were actually voluntary. There was something, your product was impacted public health, FDA was to call you and tell you that, well, we have this problem, you should do a recall. But if you did not want to do the recall, then nothing else would happen because it was voluntary. But now the law authorizes FDA to actually go to court and order you to actually perform a recall. So right now it's mandatory on the FSMA. And again, you see the requirements for procedures and records. So that's 117. We dearly call it preventive controls. And as I mentioned before, similar, basically the same thing, but instead of human food, it's food for animals. Okay, so this is a regulation on 21 CFR 507. So if you're in the industry of making food for animals, then these regulations apply to you. Or if your business actually makes food for humans and food for animals, then you know that you are covered by both regulations. Okay, both regulations are very similar. You see there what facilities are not um, covered by this regulation. You see here the requirements, basically the same thing, but again, it's focused on food for animal. Okay, so we'll just move ahead. We remember we talked about farms, and then we talk about manufacturing food for human. We talk about manufacturing food for animals, and we need to transport that from one location to the other. So there's a regulation to cover the sanitary transport of all food, because there's no point in making sure you're doing the best job there is at the farm or at the factory if your transport will ruin it all, right? So there has to be a regulation looking at sanitary transport. So who is covered by this? Who is covered by this? And let's look at this carefully. It says facilities that ship, load, move, receive, or transport food for use in the food for use in the U.S. Okay, so um, many factories have a contract with transportees. So some guys that come in with their trucks and they actually move a material to the stores or from the farm to the manufacturing site or from one manufacturing site to the other site. So there you have a contract and you have other people who do that for you. However, this regulation will certainly also apply to you because if you look there, the first word it says facilities that ship. So when you are selling something, there are some instructions on the shipment. Somebody is commanding a shipment, and the regulation actually has requirements for those personnel in charge of shipping from the shipping department. Okay, not the guys at the loading deck, but the guys at the desk selling the product and saying, "Hey, do that shipment, send this info, this material over to this site." There are also requirements for the guys at the loading deck who are actually loading the merchandise into the truck. Um, there are some regulations also or some requirements for the way or the materials that you use for moving the different products inside your factory or your farm. Um, and there are also requirements for the guys who receive the material at the other side and for the carriers per se. So this regulation has requirements for all those dealing with actually moving material from one place to the other. So you can see there the exceptions. If we are talking about food that is passing through the US but will not be consumed in the US, that this regulation does not apply. It only applies to food that is to be consumed in the US. Again, facilities on the USDA or TTB or farms are exempted from this. However, however, when we talk about uh, these facilities on the USDA jurisdiction and farms, the portion inside the facility is not covered. Now, once you go out of the facility or the farm, the regulation applies. So you have to make sure that whatever you're doing actually complies with this regulation. And again, you see here the exception. Okay, annual sales below $500,000 is a 3-year average. What's required here? The regulation has requirements on equipment and vehicles. Okay, the design, the materials that you're using for them, and very specifically the sanitary condition of that equipment and vehicle. And we're talking about equipment here, and it's not necessarily trucks that we're talking about. It actually specifically mentions like bins, any container that you're using to actually uh, move the material from one place to the other is also considered equipment. Conveyors, dollies, pallet jacks, hand trucks, anything and everything that you use to move material is actually considered equipment. And the regulation applies. So you have to look at that carefully. It also talks about transport operations, which are not transportation per se, but activities around or supporting that transport operation. Like, for example, um, maintenance of the truck or the equipment, cleaning and sanitizing operations, and calibration operations, like, for example, the cooling of the cooling unit of the trucks and all that. So there's conditions and specifications that you have to comply with. There's also a big requirement on training, of course, not only of your employees, but if you are contracting somebody to actually carry out some of these responsibilities, you have to ensure that those people are actually trained. So you can actually train them yourself, or which is something that the regulation allows, you can actually establish a contract with that person or that other business, and in that contract, you specify whatever training the employees need to have in order to perform whatever task you are passing them down. And again, you see procedures and record once again, because all regulations will require procedures and record, because if it is not written, then you never did it. So you have to, and in order to do it, you need instructions. So you need procedures with instructions, and you need record as evidence of whatever happened in your business. Okay, any questions at this point?
Okay, next time to ask questions. So if anyone has any questions, at this point, we don't have any open questions.
Okay, I do have one question. Are you still really out there and awake?
I think they should be. I see them on there, so I'm hoping they're totally in and listening in into this amazing. Oh, totally awake. There we go. We have some. We
At
have
least
some.
Tiffany's.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. If anyone has any questions regarding what the professor has been explaining so far, please feel free to share them. Again, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So instead of watching a rerun of this, you have our professor here live. So make sure you submit all those questions. So I'm awake. We're having some responses. They're out there, Professor. We have them.
Okay, good,
Okay,
good. That's good to
so
know. That's good to know.
if you want to keep going,
Okay,
then we can continue on.
okay, perfect. Let's move on. Well, let's look at the final regulations that we have here. And this one in 21 CFR 1 subpart L deals with anything and everything imported. And maybe I should not say anything and everything. Let's be more specific. This regulation actually applies to all product that is coming from outside the US or its territories that will go, in a sense, directly to the consumer. Okay, so if in my factory I'm bringing product from Italy, for example, but I'm going to be using that product as an ingredient of my goods, then this regulation does not apply. Why? Because if I am manufacturing whatever it is, say I'm manufacturing pasta here in Puerto Rico, and I'm bringing flour from Italy. I'm bringing flour from Italy, but I'm going to be using that flour for my pasta. So since I'm a manufacturing site working here, what the regulation that I need to comply with is the one dealing with manufacturing sites for human food. And as we saw before in 117, it has a requirement for me to have an approved supplier program. So I will not need to comply with this regulation in CFR 1 subpart L, because I need to comply with an equivalent one in 117 that calls for me to approve this supplier in order to be able to use it. And there is another regulation that will actually make this a lot more clear because of the requirements on that regulation. But I just wanted to clarify that not everything that comes from outside needs to comply with this law. It only refers to those importers that are actually bringing products that will directly hit the supermarket chains, okay? Say, for example, I'm bringing uh, whatever, I don't know, popcorn from Taiwan, okay? And I'm bringing that in huge beans. And what I'm gonna be doing here is repacking, okay? Then it's not going directly to the consumer. I'm actually adding some value, doing some repacking. I'm actually performing manufacturing operations there. So it's 117, it's not this one. However, if I'm bringing individual portions or bags of popcorn that I would bring it from Taiwan and put it in the shelves of the supermarket, then I have to make sure it complies with this regulation. What are the exceptions? Juice or fish products covered by other regulations, okay? Again, if you are bringing that, you have to comply with the requirement on that particular uh, regulation. Like, for example, if you are bringing juice, you have to comply with the regulation on juice because there's a regulation specifically for juice, okay? Again, alcoholic beverage is not covered here because this is an FDA regulation, and as we stated, alcoholic beverages fall under TTB. Same thing for USDA regulated produce, okay? So if you are importing product that is under USDA jurisdiction, this does not apply because USDA will actually look at that. So you need some permits in order to do that. So it's not under FSMA because there is another regulation on the USDA jurisdiction. And again, we have the exemption on qualified facilities, but this time, notice that the average annual sales is not 500,000, but 1 million. And it's 1 million if you are talking about human food, okay? If you're talking about animal food, that goes all the way up to 2.5 million. Okay? So there you go. And we're talking about not your supplier, but if you are an importer, then we're talking about your sales. What are the requirements here? Well, as an importer, you need to do a risk assessment on the product you're bringing and the supplier you're using. You need to have some way of verifying that your supplier is good. Okay, again, we're talking about similar things as the approved suppliers program in 117. Okay, so we have similar things. You need to have written corrective actions in case something happened, you receive bad product or your supplier fails to comply with X or Y, you need corrective actions. And I'm sorry, I moved here. Okay. You need to have written corrective actions uh, in order to address any bloopers that may occur. Of course, there are some always unforeseen things, and for that, there's always non-conformances report and all that stuff. Okay, but that's another whole different story. You also need, as you see here, again, procedures and records, and one particular item on this regulation is that FDA requires your suppliers as an importer, if you are an importer, your suppliers need to have unique facility identifiers. So the DONS number is uh, typically accepted as a unique facility identifier, but it has to be a number that, again, it has to be unique, and it's a way for FDA to actually verify if you are having a supplier problem. Okay, for example, say you and I are importers, and I have this particular supplier with the number 5, and you have the same supplier. Okay, now you bring some goods and I bring different goods, and say my goods are having problems in the market, so FDA can come back to me and ask about who this supplier is, and I will tell, well, it has DUNS number 5. Okay, so if they actually find that they have problems with your product, and they actually go back and say, hey, what's the DUNS number on this supplier? And you say it's also 5, then they know there's a problem with that particular supplier. And one of the things that FSMA gave FDA is the power to say, hey, you know what? You're not bringing any more product here. Okay, so they have the right to deny entry to the U.S., and they actually have also the power to detain product. Okay, so they can actually, if they identify that there is a problem with a specific supplier through different paths, they can actually do that. Okay, so moving on, there's this also this regulation. All the regulations that we looked at before actually try to deal with food safety by preventing what is called unintentional contamination, meaning that the contamination got there by either uh, lack of paying attention to what you're doing or accident. Okay, now let's clearly understand what contamination means. Contamination is anything and everything in your product that is not supposed to be there. Okay, it doesn't matter if it is good or bad to your health. If it's there and it should not be there, it's contamination. And food safety is compromised if the product has contamination. So if you have anything there that is not supposed to be there, food safety is compromised. Okay. Now this particular regulation deals with food safety, but food safety caused not by unintentional contamination, but by intentional contamination. So when we talk about intentional contamination in general terms, there are several things that we have to look at. One is what is called food fraud. Food fraud is like, for example, adding more water to the soup in order to have more soup, and we sell more food plates and we have more money. Okay, so there's an economic advantage in doing this food fraud. Another example would be like, for example, one that is actually more common is I'm selling extra virgin olive oil. Okay, so that's premium product, so you have to pay a little bit extra for premium product. Now, I wanna earn some extra bucks on this transaction. So what I'm gonna do is, instead of giving you extra virgin olive oil, I'm gonna say it's extra virgin olive oil, but I'm actually diluting that with lower grade olive oil or maybe canola oil or something like that, which is actually hard to distinguish if you are actually having good product or bad product. So I'm trying to pass lower grade product for premium product and charge you for premium product, and that's food fraud. Okay, and that falls under intentional contamination or adulteration, which is the same thing. That particular mode of intentional adulteration is outside the scope of this regulation. This regulation actually deals with the other portion, which is contamination, intentional contamination that is caused by terrorism or sabotage. And you might say, well, what's the difference? Well, when we talk about sabotage, it's basically referring or looking at the possibility of having um, unhappy employees that actually made something to do harm to you or your company, and then there's a consequence because they contaminated the product and the product went out, and I'm gonna harm this business because they did not give me whatever money I wanted or a raise or work conditions or whatnot, and they actually go out, do something to the food, put something in there intentionally, and that affects public health. So that's what this regulation is after. Okay, so it's intentional contamination with the intent of doing harm, causing harm. Okay, so it applies to all facilities that require FDA registration. Again, farms do not require FDA registration unless they are like mixed type farms that actually do some manufacturing. If that's the case, yes, it applies. But regular farms, no, you don't have to register. So the farms are there in the exceptions. And again, another exception, if your annual sales plus inventory is below 10 million, you are exempt also from this regulation. And again, inventory, it's food inventory and your ingredient. It does not include like equipment and all that kind of thing. So it's equipment, not equipment, ingredients or food. Facilities that are basically food storage, like warehouses, are exempted unless what they are storing is liquid in bulk tanks. And if you're talking about food for animals, well, that's exempted as well. Okay. So what's required in this regulation? First of all, you have to do a vulnerability assessment. Now, that sounds hard to do. However, the good news is that FDA actually drilled down this very nicely. There has been a lot of people involved in this, in the development of this regulation, and their webpage on the FDA, they have uh, they have actually identified uh, the areas that are of greater concern. And what you need to do is actually look at those areas in your manufacturing site, identify that, identify those areas, and establish mitigation strategies. And again, the good news is that they have a whole bunch of uh, options, acceptable options for mitigation strategies. Um, and once you do your assessment and establish your mitigation strategies, what you need to do is monitor that everything is working as it should be. Of course, again, you need training and you need procedures and records. Okay, so that's intentional adulteration. Moving on, there's this one. It's also in CFR 1, but this one is Subpart M. And this one has to do with third-party audits on food safety. This regulation is not applicable to farms or manufacturing sites or transportists. This is for certification bodies and accreditation bodies. So I'm going to explain here. Um, we talked, if you remember, we talked about 117 and the requirement to have an approved suppliers program, okay? So I need to somehow determine that my supplier is good, it's good for my money, okay? So if we go to 117, it tells you, well, there are several things you can do. You can actually ask them to submit records to you, and you can evaluate those records and determine if that's good enough. And you can actually say, well, this product is safe to consume because what they did and they provided evidence of that. That's one way. Another way is for you to get into a car or a plane, actually go to that site and conduct an audit, which would be what is called a second party audit, because it's you going to their site to audit. A third alternative there is to actually contract somebody to go to their site and conduct the safety audit. Okay, so this third person or third party should have nothing to do with you or with me. Okay, so it's an independent person of the uh, two parties involved in the transaction. So it's a third party. It has nothing to do with the one side or another. And they come and they conduct an audit and determine if the supplier is complying with the requirements on the different regulations. And that is called a food safety third-party audit. Okay, so when third parties go to the site, they will actually take a comparison of whatever is happening at the site against the requirements on the regulation. And if they determine that you are complying with the regulation, they will emit a certificate, a food safety certificate. Now, I'm going to take a minute here to clarify several things. And this on the certificate, put it aside. Don't remind me if I don't clarify that, but I will. I'm sure I will. Um, so it's important to understand how this scheme works. Uh, yes, Tiffany, I do a little one. I'll give you in a second. I'll get to that in a second. Um, the way this works is that again, if you want to be audited, okay, if you want to be audited, you first have to comply with the regulation. Once you comply with your regulation, then you seek out one of these certification bodies and make a contract. And once the agreement is signed and everything, they will come in, they will perform an audit, look at your documents, look at your records, your process. They will go through your site and make sure that you are complying with the regulation. If everything is fine and dandy, they will actually give you your food safety certificate. Now, there could be a chance, for example, that the guy in the certification body is the cousin of my wife. Okay, so he's gonna treat me well and he's my buddy and so on and so forth. Well, that cannot happen because that certification body has actually to also comply with some requirements, and they are also audited by what is called an accreditation body. Okay, so there's a whole structure to make sure that these certificates are valid, are good, that nobody can cheat, and when they give you a certificate, it actually means that you are playing the right cards, that you are doing things by the book, okay? So I said I needed to clarify something. This certification or this certificate is for the business. We are not talking here about you going to a training or taking a course. I took the course, I passed whatever test, if there happened to be one, and now I have a certificate, okay? You can do that and you have a certificate of your own. It's a certificate for you, for the person who took the training. But in all these regulations, once you take the training, you have to go out and implement everything that the regulation requires. Now, once you do that implementation, once you do all that work and you document everything and you have your records and you train all your people and everything, then you seek out to these to these certification bodies, make a contract, depending on who you call, the extent of the certification. There are different criteria there. It might cost you, I don't want to get into much trouble here, but say uh, two, three, $4,000 per year. And then they will come in and do the audit. And if you comply with everything, they will give you your certificate. Okay. So now, why is this regulation here? Again, if we go back to 117 or we go back to the foreign supplier regulation. I need to somehow approve my supplier. Okay, so I can either put my money on the line and go out and audit, or have somebody request send their records and have somebody in my staff spending the time I'm paying for to evaluate those records, or simply say, hey, you want to be my supplier? You need to give me a food safety certificate. And if you give me that, I'll have you as a supplier. Okay. So now you're putting the burden in their shoulders. So they will, if they want to do business with you, they have to go out and get a certificate. Okay. And the market is actually moving all of us in that direction. And if they haven't knocked your door yet, they will eventually, because again, the market is moving on in that direction. Um, Chances are you will, if you haven't already, you will soon be trying to make business or supply your product to somebody else, say, for example, Walmart, which is actually requesting already this type of certificate, okay, a food safety certificate. So if you're trying to do business with Walmart or Costco or Sam's, they will require this. So again, if you want to continue growing, chances are this is eventually going to hit you. So you see that this regulation actually tries to or attempts to establish such a scheme or such a structure to allow the different players in the food supply chains to actually have a document that says, yes, we are complying with the regulations and you can buy with us. Our product is safe for consumption. So approve us as a supplier and let's do business, okay? In terms of content of the law, basically, again, it's not for us, it's for the accreditation bodies, the certification bodies, and it includes all the documentation that they need to supply. It also has the specifications of what needs to be done in order to actually emit a food safety certificate. And it also has conditions on the auditor's competencies or qualifications in order to be able to play a role as an auditor in this audit. Okay, so that's everything that is included in that regulation. And with that, if you have been counting, that's 7. So those are the 7 that are currently in effect. The one that is still missing is this one, and it deals with traceability. And I start here by saying 21 CFR 1 Subpart J. Actually, this regulation is still in draft. Okay, so it doesn't have a place to live yet. However, if you go to 1 Subpart J, you will see there that there currently are some requirements for records, right? Requirements that records in any FDA um, business need to comply with. So to me, it makes perfect sense that since the intent is to add additional requirements to records to capture traceability data, it will reside there. They will just put it together with whatever they already have on records. So I'm, maybe stretching here a bit, saying, well, most probably there will be, but stay tuned. We don't know yet. There's a chance it could be there. There's a chance they just look some pre-sales and just put it there. Um, who does it apply to? Well, it doesn't apply to everybody. It applies to those facilities that actually work, process, manufacture, or produce, or have them as ingredients, a specific set of products that they have identified and they put together in a list, and I will show you in a minute. Who does it apply to? facilities with more than 300 hens or average annual sales of 25,000. That's a 3-year average. And if you look at this, it sounds like farms, okay? Actually, yes, that's true, because basically all products in that list are farm related, are farm products. So there you have it. And what is the requirement? The requirement is to capture what they call essential information elements or key information elements. So what does that mean? So again, if there is an event, if there is an outbreak, and your product is involved in some food poisoning event, and they come back to you, they will ask some specific questions about the product, what happened to the product, how was it processed, and stuff. So what they are asking in this regulation is for you to be certain that you are collecting the answers to the questions they will be asking to. Okay, so that's what they call key information elements or essential information elements. And they have identified what they call critical traceability events. So it's not that they will be asking all sorts of crazy information, but they have identified, well, these are the critical steps that we need information from. And this is the specific information that we need. So what they are actually doing is telling you, be sure to collect this data, because in case something happens, we will need that information. And the sooner we have that information, the faster we can react and take action to prevent foodborne diseases. Okay. The other requirement, of course, if you're doing traceability, is that you need to have a lot code. Here is the list of products that they have identified: soft cheeses, shelled eggs, nut or peanut butter, cucumbers, herbs, leafy greens, melons, peppers, sprouts, tomatoes, tropical tree fruits, fresh cut or vegetables, fresh cut fruits or vegetables, fin fish, crustacean, mollusk, and ready-to-eat salads. Okay, as you can see there, most of those are coming out of farms. So that's what they are putting together for the traceability law. This one it took a longer time because they have for many years now been talking about traceability and the need to do that all across. They are inviting every player in the food supply chain to voluntarily extend this data collection to all the products, but they are requiring only this one. They have not forced everyone in the food chain to do this because they understand that this has like cost implications that might put out of business the smaller guys. Okay, so that's why they actually decided to do this, and the determination of these products was based on history, the outbreaks that we've had in the last I don't know how many years. And these are the main culprits, if you want to see it that way. Okay, what's next? Dates, compliance dates. In here, you have the different laws and you have the different compliance dates. The compliance dates are divided by size, very small, small, or the other. This is the produce safety rules. If you notice, there are two different dates because this one are the dates for sprouts, and this one are the dates for all of the products. And if you notice in this table, except for the intentional adulteration on very small businesses, all dates already passed. Okay, so if you haven't complied yet with the regulation, well, we better get started, okay? And the point to get started is actually get trained, right? This is an overview. It doesn't count as you're being trained. So you have to actually find out who can actually give you the standardized curriculum and get the training on the regulation. Like for example, on the intentional adulteration, the FDA has put together training online, so you can actually do it anytime, day or night. It's very simple. It's like 3 different courses that you need to take. Um, the one on product safety rule, there's a 2 day. It's a 2 day training. Excuse me. The one on the preventive controls. Excuse me. The one on the preventive controls is also a 2 day training. Transport. Um, Actually, I believe there's none for transport in terms of standardized curriculum, but um, like for example, when we do GMP, we have a training on GMP, and we include the transport law. And there is also a course for foreign supplier regulation. So you have all the different regulations there and training that you can take. So if you need to comply, make sure you take the training and start putting together your procedures and, and, and complying with the different requirements on the different regulations. So to close down, this is a summary, final summary. Again, we see that FSMA brought many changes. Again, it started by changing the focus, the FDA focus from reaction to prevention. And it's doing that by starting at the farm. We have to ensure that whatever comes out of the farm complies with food safety requirements. At the manufacturing sites, we are not only complying with GMPs, but it's also requesting a food safety plan and to establish preventive controls to assure that everything coming out of manufacturing sites is safe to consume. And then there's also regulation for intentional adulteration. In terms of what next after preventing, well, they need to make sure that you're complying. And how do they do that? Well, there's facility registration. You have to register. Some facilities have to register. As we already explained, there are periodic inspections of product, of records, and facilities. So one thing I did not mention before, that the good news is on compliance dates, that even though they already passed, FDA typically starts performing the inspections about 1 year after the compliance date. So there is still chance, if you haven't met the requirements already, you might still be able to put together your act. And of course, in terms of compliance, they are asking you to do lab tests. Like for example, at farms, they are calling for water quality tests to make sure that they comply with pathogen levels and so on and so forth. Same thing for manufacturing sites. You need to make sure that you are testing your product somehow to assure food safety. In terms of response, remember now recalls are mandatory. They used to be voluntary, but they are mandatory now. They have requirements for detection of adulterated product, like when they can actually take samples and perform tests on their own and detect if the product has been adulterated. And if things happen, they actually have the authority to suspend your registration. And if your registration is suspended, you can actually manufacture, but you cannot sell. Okay, so you cannot have your product in the market. So if your registration is suspended, you're basically out of business, at least out of the US business. Again, traceability, improved traceability requirements for improved response, and records are the key in every corner. We saw them in absolutely all the different regulations. And finally, there are requirements on import. Okay, the importer has to make sure that the suppliers is using provide products that meets basically the same standards as it would locally produced product. Okay, so now the competition is even. There's no more unfair competition. We also have the third-party certifications, the traceability efforts identifying the high-risk foods, and remember, FDA also have the authority to detain your product and deny entry.